Welcome. So, this week we're going to be going over the general election, especially as it relates to the presidency. Specifically for this lecture, we're going to be discussing the shift from the primary to the general. Second, we're going to cover what structural factors or fundamentals affect general election outcomes. But this time, let's jump right into shifting from the primary to the general. In the primary, you are essentially throwing other competitive candidates from your own party under the bus in order for you to win. On the left, we can see Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders disagreeing during a primary debate during 2016. But once Clinton seized the nomination, you'll note that a lot of that animosity disappears, and they're now pretty chummy. See this pretty picture on the right? This is because for the success of the party, you need to cohere around one candidate and support the candidate who won. This also is meant to heal some of the fissures exposed in the primary and create a more unified party to where all supporters of both Clinton and Sanders, can unite behind one candidate, in this case, Clinton. Although sometimes the animosity from the primaries can spill over into the general. So here we can see Senator Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas who ran against Trump in the 2016 primary. During that primary, Trump accused Cruz's father of assassinating JFK. This is what this Inquirer ad is right here. Yes, really, that is what his father was accused of. By Trump. This is obviously unsubstantiated. But after Trump has essentially won the nomination, Cruz spoke at the 2016 Republican convention, and he doesn't bother to endorse Trump, which is pretty unusual. He instead recommends voters to vote their conscience. There were boos. It was incredibly awkward. There were threats against Ted Cruz's wife, who was in the audience. In any case, the point is that in the primary, you do have to be supportive after the primary of members of your own party, but the attacks and bad blood within the party that you sort of sowed in the primary can't be so extreme that then they can't cohere around one candidate for the general election, right? Essentially, you can't have a ton of fighting in the primary to where you like trash each other a lot, because it's possible that some of that might not be able to be undone by the time you get to the general election, because ultimately you will want your party's candidate to win. Okay. The other thing to remember is that voters in the primary are different than the voters in the general election. This means that candidates must sort of switch and tweak their platforms or positions when moving from the primary to the general. In the primary, many states are either closed or semi-closed, where only members of that party can vote for the party's candidate. So in a closed primary, if I'm a Republican, I can only vote for the Republican candidates in the primary, not the Democratic ones. In other words, in the primary, candidates are trying to appeal to the median voter from their party, which is either far more liberal or far more conservative than the median voter of the entire electorate. Moreover, usually these voters who participate in primaries tend to be more engaged, more informed than those who participate in the general election. In other words, they're more informed, more engaged, and more partisan than the average general election participant, the average general election voter. Now, in the general election, the candidates are competing over the same median voter, the median voter of the entire electorate. Candidates have to be careful to not take too liberal or too conservative of positions in the primary, because they will ultimately need to moderate their positions in the general election so that they are more palatable to the broader electorate, like independents or centrists from the other party. But there are questions about how feasible this really is to move from your party's center to the electorate's center as a presidential candidate. Given that the electorate has become more polarized over time, appealing to your party's center and then the electorate's center is actually quite hard and can be a larger shift than it used to be. Look at how the median voter in 1994 for Democrats and Republicans, they're quite close together, ideologically at least, and they've grown much further apart. This will be tricky to reconcile for presidential candidates in more recent years as they've grown further apart, right? So if you are appealing to the median Democrat these days, the shift over to the median voter is going to be quite a bit bigger, okay? And that presents a challenge for most primary candidates. Now, and really, we need to talk about how feasible is this really going to be, okay? But let's jump into the fundamentals because these are super duper important. Bartels and Zoller mentioned many things that best predict whether the incumbent president's party is going to win the election or not. First, there are wars, which literature shows might hurt the president's party at the ballot box. Bartels and Zoller find that both the Korean War and the Vietnam War are costly in terms of votes to the incumbent president's party. Second, there is ideological moderation. If a candidate is more moderate than their counterpart, they find that they're more likely to win the general, at least according to Bartels and Zoller. Now, Bartels and Zoller's analysis is, of course, limited to elections that are probably a little less polarized than the ones we see today. But for the most part, ideological moderation, it just means like you have chosen a moderate candidate who can probably appeal to a broad base of Americans, okay? Then there is incumbency. Eventually, the American public gets tired of only having one party in power, right? We like things to change occasionally. Bartels and Zoller call this incumbent party fatigue. So if your party has been in power for 8 to 12 years, expect that the American public might want to shift back to that other party. Fourth, but really the biggest fundamental is the economy. Okay, I'll shift back to approval ratings in a minute. The biggest fundamental is the economy. If the economy is doing well, then the incumbent party is going to be rewarded, electorally speaking. If the economy isn't doing well, then the incumbent party might be punished. But one of the points that Bartels and Zoller are making is what facets of the economy are people most aware of? Bartels and Zoller are arguing that most voters don't pay too much attention to GDP, right? But instead are more interested in personal income. So these are facets of the economy. Income is a facet of the economy that people are more aware of than necessarily the stock market or GDP. Just be aware that parts of the economy are more or less visible to the electorate, right? You don't pay attention to everything that occurs out there, but there are some things that are more tangible to you than others. But finally, in that piece from Rakich that you read, he is arguing that we should be most aware of presidential approval in determining which party will benefit during midterms, not necessarily the economy. If the president has high approval ratings, then his party will benefit at midterms. If the president has low approval ratings, then his party will be electorally punished, right? So it's not necessarily the economy that we should be looking at in the midterms. The economy matters quite a bit for presidential election years, but midterms, we should instead be looking more towards presidential approval ratings, okay? So for this lecture, we covered shifting from the primary to the general and what structural factors or fundamentals affect general election outcomes. Now make sure to pop over and watch the second video lecture this week, and I will see you over there.